I was stunned when James opened the door and walked in on Michael and me having sex. At first, it seemed like Michael didn't realize James was there in the room with us as he was concentrating on screwing me, but I was finally able to push him off me. In the months that followed, I realized that he was so busy screwing me that he was determined to do so no matter what happened. He must have suspected James would do nothing after he'd screwed me every day and night on our cruise. At first, I was speechless, but then managed to say, "James, what are you doing here?" I can explain everything." I felt stupid because that's all I said. The look on James's face told me I'd hurt him so badly, so deeply, and at the time, I didn't comprehend the depth of his pain. All he said was, "Don't bother coming home, Amy. You can have your divorce. You win. You two can have each other for all I care. Just like you did every day on the ship." My mind was in turmoil as I thought, how could the man I loved with all my heart for 15 years say that to me? Michael was just sex to me. Well, that was a lie. I loved him a little, otherwise I wouldn't have let him screw me again, but it was nothing like how much I loved James. This was going to be the last time I was going to see Michael. He was screwing me as his birthday present to me. Maybe flowers might have been more appropriate, but after our affair on the cruise, I couldn't resist his special present. When my mind cleared a little, I realized he had said, "You can have your divorce, you win." What was he talking about? I'd never divorce him. He was just angry, that was all. Then as James stormed out the door, it hit me what else he said. "Just like you did every day on the ship." Oh my God, no. Oh shit. Please God, no. He can't have known about us screwing on the cruise. We were so careful, and he was back in our cabin sick the whole time. I always went back to our cabin to have sex with him after Michael was finished with me every night, but he was always asleep, and I didn't want to wake him up because he had been so sick. I wanted to chase James into the car park to explain. I would have run out there naked to catch him. I wish I had. If I had caught up to him, I could have told him I loved him, but Michael grabbed my wrist and pulled me back to the bed and started screwing me again. I struggled until Michael told me, "A few extra minutes won't hurt now, will it?" Besides, if he has known this long and he knew we were screwing every day on the cruise, then he couldn't be serious in what he said. In fact, he probably got his jollies knowing what we did. He loved the thought of your screwing me, then you going back to him every night. Amy, don't you get it? It turns him on. Some husbands are that, and James must be one of them. I wanted to believe him when he said that James hadn't been hurt by what I'd been doing, and I soon forgot about him as Michael made love to me continuously for what seemed like hours. I was in heaven and lost track of time, and I thought Michael had the stamina of a Superman. When I had time later to think about my last time with Michael, I suspected it was most probably just Viagra. Next thing I knew, James opened the door again. I wish we'd locked it. My 4 children came running in and the door slammed shut. James didn't come in this time. But why did he send our children in when he knew I was in bed with Michael? If he liked what I was doing with Michael, why did he do that? Something wasn't right in what Michael had told me. My children stopped and stared at Michael and me as he kept screwing me. My kids had never seen James and me making love. But Michael had no shame. It was Laura, my oldest, who brought me back to earth just when she screamed, "Mummy, you're disgusting. You're nothing but a common street 304. No wonder Daddy was upset and crying." I felt cheap as Laura described me when Michael finished with me. My children were now crying, and with Michael off me, I could now see them staring at me, at my nakedness. I didn't know what to say to them. I was so humiliated and disgusted in myself. I covered my mouth and raised my arm to them, but they just stood there. Then I realized I was naked. In my complete and total shame, I covered myself with the sheet we'd been screwing on as Laura ushered the other 3 outside. I got off the bed and went to the bathroom to quickly shower and clean up, and as I showered, I remembered everything James had said when he walked in on us screwing earlier, and I knew I had to find him and tell him that he was the only man I loved. I said goodbye to Michael, and I felt even cheaper when he laughed as I grabbed my suitcase James had thrown into the room. I left knowing what I had done was so wrong. I felt so used. The door slamming shut behind me was so symbolic. I just didn't realize how much at the time. I stood there looking around the car park, hoping James was somehow still there, waiting for me. Tears came to my eyes when I finally grasped the fact that he was nowhere to be seen. He was gone. I could hear my children in the car crying as they waited for me to take them home, but in my shame, I couldn't look at them knowing what they had seen me doing with Michael. My memory of the look of horror on their faces and their hatred for me in their eyes was burned into my mind. When I shut my eyes, the recollection of their reaction and James's words kept repeating in my head and made me shake in fear for what was coming. I was brought back to earth by Laura screaming out to me, "We hate it here and we hate you. We want to go home." I was shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what I had done to my family set in. I put the suitcase in the back of the car, then it took me a couple of goes to start the engine before we sped off for home. My children were all still crying and were refusing to talk to me. I sensed that even the youngest knew what a cheap 304 I was. I wanted to explain my actions if that was possible, and tried talking to them the whole time, but they refused to answer me or even acknowledge I spoke. They refused to talk, and my mind drifted back to what had happened to cause the apparent destruction of my marriage. We had finally saved up enough for our dream cruise. It seemed like every time we'd been close to affording it previously, something came up. Some expense we hadn't planned on. If it wasn't that it was one of the kids getting so sick, we couldn't leave them with anyone. Finally, our opportunity arrived, and we were able to go on our South Pacific cruise. Things didn't go as I planned. James was sick every day and night from the moment we left port and stayed in our cabin until the morning we disembarked. I dreamed for years that I would dance the night away every day, and still wanted to dance, so went by myself. That was something I truly regretted now. I had plenty of offers to dance with the strange men around me, and then I met the nicest man. It was so romantic, and I soon found myself out on deck with him. We walked in the moonlight around the decks as we held each other closely, then he kissed me and I forgot about my sick husband waiting for me in our cabin. We ended up in his bed together. Maybe I could have blamed the alcohol or the magical atmosphere, but at the end of the day I still cheated. James was sick the whole time, so I spent every moment I could with my lover. I told myself it was only a holiday thing, and I would make it all up to James when we got back home. Except it didn't happen. I loved James so much, but I still hated his touching me. We hadn't had sex since he got me pregnant with the twins. I wouldn't let him even hold my hand. My feelings of guilt only made it so much worse for me, and when I found myself wanting some loving, I would freeze up and push him away from my fears of having more babies. When we got home, I tried to make love to him every night, but my guilt from straying made me so sick I would end up vomiting before bed. James missed out again. He never seemed the same after we arrived home. There was a sadness in his eyes I'd never seen before. His moods changed quickly, and the placid husband I had before the cruise was gone. There was definitely something on his mind eating away at him. Deep down I wondered if he somehow knew I cheated and was having trouble dealing with it. What James had said to me in the motel confirmed that he knew of my illicit affair on the boat. Why didn't James stop me if he knew what I was doing? It felt so good to make love to Michael after so many years going without sex, but why couldn't I make love to the man who meant so much to me? The afternoon with Michael had been a total surprise, and until James came in I had enjoyed the excitement and the raw sex again. I'd been at home when my cell phone rang. It was Michael. Amy, I am in town on business for the day, and I want to visit to give you a special present for your birthday. I refused his wanting to come to our home in case the neighbors became suspicious and told James. Maybe I wondered if something would happen, or maybe I wanted something to happen. More likely the latter. As much as I loved James, I missed Michael's passionate sex. I replied, I'll meet you at your motel in 30 minutes. I can't stay long. We usually have a special dinner on my birthday, and I left to seal my fate. Michael was waiting for me when I arrived. My mind was screaming for me to stop, but my lust had taken over and Michael did whatever he wanted with me. For the moment I was his to screw and I forgot James again. I had no idea how James knew I was there with Michael. My God, I'd messed up my life. I prayed it wouldn't cost me my marriage. I recalled that one day on the boat Michael and I had just come on deck after screwing like rabbits in his suite, and for some reason had discussed marriage and divorce. I remembered we'd just been fooling around and I had said something silly like, just think, if we both got divorced we could live together and screw like we've been doing every day. He told me how nice that would be, but we both knew we didn't mean it. Both of knew it was just a cruise romance and we'd never see each other again. There were so many people around us, but we knew none of them, so I didn't care if they heard or not. I am sure some of them did. I had actually felt quite wicked knowing they heard we were lovers and were making love every day. The journey home seemed to take so long, and when we arrived home, I rushed inside to find my husband, the man I needed to hold. I ran to the bedroom and heaved a sigh of relief when I saw that all of James' clothes and toiletries were still there, so I knew he hadn't left me. I still had a chance to save my marriage. I fed the children, and they had their baths, then finished their homework before going to bed. They all refused to kiss me goodnight and kept crying and calling for their father. I kept telling them he'd be home soon. Our special dinner warming in the oven was ruined while I waited in the lounge room for James as the night grew later and later. I desperately needed to tell him how much I really loved him and how much he meant to me. It must have been years since I told him that. I tried his cell phone every few minutes since I arrived home, but it was switched off all the time. William, one of my twins, woke me in the morning so I could make his school lunch as he ate his breakfast. His stomach was like an alarm clock. I'd fallen asleep waiting for James to come home. I'd had nightmares about James all night. It was like he was there with me, but he looked so pale, so haunting. The sadness in his sunken eyes and the look of sorrow on his face had scared me. All I wanted to do was to reach out to touch him, but my hand went right through him. I became desperate and tried to hold him, and he just kept slipping through my arms like I'd lost him forever. I rushed to our bedroom, and everything was as I had left it the night before. James wasn't in our bed, and now I was seriously worried about him. In all our 15 years, the only time we had spent apart was when I was having our children. Laura just glared at me if I went near her, but I finally got all the kids in the car, and to school, then returned home to wait for James, but he didn't show up. I needed to talk with him. To explain, Michael meant nothing to me, and I loved him more than anything else in the world. That my life was meaningless without him. I decided to phone his work, and they told me he'd had Thursday off to surprise me for my birthday. They asked if we'd a good time. He had surprised me all right. Before I could ask if I could speak with him, they asked me if he was sick as he wasn't at work. I was shocked as he never missed a day at work in his life, and I lied and said he'd been ill all night, and I'd get him to phone when he came home from the doctor's. They asked why I called, and I told them he had asked that I phone them to say he was going to the doctor's, and I'd forgotten to phone earlier. I rang my parents, his family, and everyone we knew to see if they'd seen him last night, and I told them we'd had a small disagreement over nothing, and he didn't come home. I was so worried about him. No one had seen or heard from him, but they promised they'd get him to phone me when they did. Our closest friends confided in me that James had organized a belated birthday party for me combined with an anniversary party for us on Saturday, and had invited everyone we knew. So I realized I'd see him by then, and he was probably just staying away to clear his head after seeing me screwing Michael. I convinced myself Michael must have been right, that James enjoyed watching me have sex with him, but I still needed him and wanted to hold him. All day I had a terrible feeling of complete loss. It was a total emptiness I'd never felt before. If Friday was the longest day of my life, Friday night was worse as I tried waiting up for him again. As I had wandered around the house without purpose on Friday while I waited for James to come home, or at least telephone me, I found everything for our party stored neatly in the shelves and in the refrigerators in the garage. He'd forgotten nothing. He'd even remembered his favorite diet sarsaparilla. I knew then he'd be home soon. I couldn't wait. I finally wanted to make love to him again after so many years. I had everything ready for the party as all of our friends arrived with their children on Saturday. My own children finally emerged from their rooms and left the house to play with the young visitors, but still without saying a word to me. I overheard my nosy sister-in-law asking my youngest two if James had been home yet. The twins answered together like they usually did. Daddy came to see us the last 2 nights while Mummy was asleep. He told us he would always be there to keep an eye on us and make sure we were okay. My sister-in-law just said, "That's good. Does your mummy know?" They just shook their heads, then she walked away to join the other adults. James must have been home each night to see their kids, but something must be seriously wrong. Maybe he's moved out. It must be bad. Maybe he'll tell us when he gets here. I heard what she said. What a bitch. I was getting worried about James again, but was also somewhat angry he hadn't shown up for my party he'd organized. I still wanted to hold him so badly now and tell him how much I missed him and that I really did love him. I wanted to make it up to him somehow. All of it. I wanted him to make love to me. I thought back to how I had denied him for the past 6 years and then cucking him on the cruise. I had so much to make up for, even if what Michael had said was true. I was busy with some guests when the doorbell rang and my dad went to answer it. He didn't come back, so a few minutes later my mother went to get him, thinking he had probably fallen asleep on the lounge like he usually did. She didn't return either, so I went to get them, thinking they were probably having a little tiff again. I walked in to see my parents, both sitting on the lounge crying with 2 policemen standing next to them talking. They all looked up at me when they saw me come into the room, and one of the police suggested to my mother that she make some tea or coffee. As I approached them, one of them looked at a photo in his hand. It looked about the same size as the one of me that James kept in his wallet. The policeman asked, "Are you Amy Marshall?" My heart was in my mouth as I responded, "Yes, I am. Is James hurt? Is he all right? Please tell me." My mother burst into tears as she went into the kitchen, and I heard the kettle switched on. My father stood up and put his arm around my shoulders and sat me down on the lounge as he sat next to me. The policeman continued, "Mrs. Marshall, we're so sorry, but we have to inform you that your husband is dead." I sat stunned, unable to breathe, as I saw my friends and family gathering at archway into the kitchen on one side and the door to the family room on the other. They were silently spilling through the doorways, all looking shocked, and were holding their spouses tightly. No one was talking. They were all biting their lips or their mouths were open. There wasn't a sound apart from the sobs of family and friends starting to cry. He resumed, "He left a note for us and a very private letter for you. We opened your letter. I hope you understand we had to read it. It's very personal, and he gives you the reasons for what he has done. It looks like he took his own life late on Thursday afternoon. His vehicle was well concealed, and it wasn't seen until a few hours ago by some bike riders, and he was discovered then. It was too late for him. I am so sorry. Could we get a member of your family or a close friend to follow us to the morgue to identify his body, please? Or if you feel up to it, it's really only a formality now. I saw his brother step forward and say, I am his brother. I'll do it. Our parents are dead and I am the oldest. It's the least I can do for him. The policeman looked to me as if asking if it was acceptable to me. I couldn't bear to see James lying dead on a cold slab, even though our bed must have seemed like it to him most nights for so long. I knew instantly I wanted to remember him alive, so I nodded slowly. Then everything seemed to slow down and went black as I felt myself leaning forward and falling to the floor. I woke some time later in my bed hoping it had all been a nightmare. My parents were in my bedroom sitting next to me on a couple of chairs. I remembered the words the policeman said as he told me James was dead. I argued quietly to myself, he couldn't have died on Thursday afternoon. The boys said he visited them on Thursday and Friday nights. I looked to my father and saw he was holding the letter James had written to me. It was supposed to be private, but he'd obviously read it. He was shaking his head as he looked at me and he was crying. I'd never seen my dad crying before. I sat up quickly and exclaimed, "The children! Where are my children?" My mother answered as she handed me a cup of hot tea. "They're with your brother. They're all understandably very upset and so angry with you." We didn't realize until it was too late that all the kids had walked into the house as the police were telling you about James. They'd seen their car outside and came in to see what was happening. "Amy, they're blaming you for James' death and are refusing to stay in the house or be anywhere near you. They even packed their bags before they left with your brother. They said they're never coming back to you. You have to understand that we couldn't stop them. They told everyone at the party what they saw you doing on Thursday afternoon with your lover. You've no idea how much we hoped they were making it up, but then we read James's letter, and it confirmed everything they said. Amy, how could you? The letter said that you totally destroyed him when you cucked him every night on your cruise. He heard you were going to divorce him to live with your lover and take the children from him." I was crying again. I couldn't help it as I thought, no one was ever supposed to know anything about Michael and me. Now my life's destroyed. My God, where did James get the idea I wanted to divorce him? I'd never do that. I was finished with Michael. I only wanted my husband. I could tell even now that my parents refused to forgive me. She continued, "You've absolutely no idea how ashamed I am to be your mother. You did such a terrible thing to someone who worshipped the ground you walked on. James loved you more than anything else in the world, and you completely crushed him. Amy, you destroyed someone who loved you. I am sorry, Amy, but you killed him as sure as stick a knife through his heart. Actually, a knife through his heart might have been more human, as it would have been quicker than dying slowly over a few weeks knowing of your adultery. I wanted my mother to forgive me like a priest would give absolution, but she didn't stop berating me. I looked to my father for help, but he couldn't see me. His head was now in his hands as he continued to cry for the man I destroyed. Or was he crying because I had caused the tragedy that had unfolded around me? My mother should have been there for me in my time of sorrow, but she wasn't. She was in the room with me, but there were no words of support. She gave one last salvo. "You, Amy, are directly responsible for James taking his own life, and you're also responsible for your children hating you now. I can't begin to think what your friends will say when they hear you were at home partying on as you celebrated your birthday and your wedding anniversary when your husband lay dead in a park because he was too ashamed of your cheating. Some loving wife you are. Did you cheat on your wedding night too? James had hurt me so much by killing himself. I thought I was devoted to him, and I called out, 'But I love him. Why did he kill himself? I never wanted to hurt him. He wasn't supposed to find out. How did he know?' I reached over and pulled my letter from my father's hands as my mother's words kept ringing in my ears. As I read his letter, my tears kept flowing. 'My dearest Amy, please don't forget me and that I loved you with all my heart and soul. I loved you more than life itself, and I can't believe that my love wasn't enough for you. Words will never express how hurt I was to discover you no longer loved me, Amy. These past few years have been terribly difficult as you drifted away from me. Before that, I honestly believed we had a perfect life together. Amy, I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. Without you, I am nothing and cannot face another day without your love. I couldn't bear to face my neighbors, family, and friends with them all knowing you had willingly cucked me like you have. Worse still is that I allowed myself to become an accepting cuck every night on the cruise, and I can't live with myself for letting that happen. Why would you hurt me like that? I'd pledged my eternal love for you, and I'll be thinking of you and the love we once had together as I take my final breath in a short time. Amy, I still love you so much. I always have since we first met all those wonderful years ago, and I'll continue loving you for the rest of time if that's possible. I want you so much, but you keep pushing me away. I can't believe you now hate me so much. Do you remember before our cruise when I told you how I couldn't live without you? I can't live without your love, so when I heard you tell him you divorced me so you could be with him, there would be no point in my existence. I have received advice that if you divorced me, I would lose the children as well. Living without you and my darling children would mean a very slow, painful death for me, and you've left me the only option available. I pray that you'll be very happy with Michael and the children learn to love him in time. Please remind the children of me every so often and tell them I love them so much. Tell your parents I love them like they were my own, and I would have missed them as well. It's too late to wish we'd never gone on the cruise. In any case, you had looked forward to it so much. Even though I knew I would be seasick, I wanted to make it a special time for us and reignite our love for each other after the difficult time we've had for the past 6 years when you've refused me. I was destroyed when I discovered you went willing to Michael, and you started having the affair from the very first night on the cruise. One night was bad enough, but you willing went back to him every day and night, including our night, our anniversary. Amy, I really hoped letting your affair happen would solve your problems, and you would love me again. So I did nothing to stop you, and I prayed I could eventually get over the unbelievable pain and hurt you caused me, and that I could soon forgive you. I wanted to believe your affair would have been just a romantic cruise thing, and once home our lives would return to normal, but they didn't. After you screwed him, you still treated me like a leper when we came home, and refused me even the most basic of marital pleasures. When you made love to him again this afternoon, it became obvious you no longer felt anything for me. Please understand I couldn't confront you on the cruise in case it drove you further away from me. I waited for you to leave him this afternoon after I disturbed you, and come home with me, but you didn't leave him. Before I left, I stood next to the door, and it was obvious from the noise who you loved. You have no idea of my pain and humiliation I felt knowing you were with him, giving him the love that should have been mine. Amy, I thought I was stronger, but you have finally succeeded in totally destroying me through your actions. They only confirmed my worst fears that you no longer wanted me in your life. I wanted to stop you meeting with him during the cruise, but even when you were with me in the cabin, it was obvious your mind was with him. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine you would continue it after we came home. I'd hoped you'd quickly forget him, but finding you and Michael together making love in that motel made me finally realize you'd made your choice and I'd lost you forever. I can't live without you, Amy, and I realize there's no longer a place in your heart for me. I have no future, no life worth living without you. My life is finished now that I've lost you forever, and I cannot keep going on living knowing that you love someone else now. You've taken away my reason for living. I will love you forever. Your loving husband, James. My tears were streaming down my face as I called out, "But James, I don't love anyone else. I am so sorry. You were sick, and it was so romantic on the cruise. I never thought you'd find out. James, please come back to me." But of course he couldn't. Turning to my father, I held out my hand, wanting his reassurance I still had his love. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head slowly, and with his head held low, he slowly walked away from me and out of the room. Now that I was awake, my mother told me, "We have to pick up the kids from your brother's place and take them home with us. Amy, they have refused to stay here any longer. In any case, your father's taken James's death really hard and is shocked at your cheating. He's very uncomfortable about the whole situation and wants to go home as soon as possible." A few minutes later, I watched my parents drive off to pick up my children. My house was empty, with only the sound heard being that of a mantel clock ticking. As I walked around the house aimlessly, the full realization of what I had done to my husband and family hit me. I was alone in my misery and had no one to talk to, no one to share my love with or my grief. Even my parents and children had left me. I had always shared a special bond with my father, and now that seemed severed as well. All of our friends had gone as well. As I crumpled to the floor, I cried out again, "No, James. No, it was only you I loved. I am so sorry. I didn't realize you knew. I didn't realize I was hurting you not being with you. Oh God, I didn't think you'd know. I didn't want you to find out." The funeral was held the following Friday. James had a lovely service at our church, then he was buried next to his parents. I never realized he was so popular, and there was standing room only in the church. There were even people standing outside the door as well. By then, everyone must have known what I'd done to him, as the minister and my mother were the only ones who spoke to me before and after the service and at the gravesite. They all came to farewell James, but not to share their sorrow at his death with me. It was most telling when my children sat with my parents in a separate pew away from me. No one sat with me, not even my own brothers and sisters. None of the mourners spoke to me. They avoided me like I had the plague. They all just looked at me. I knew they were staring and whispering to each other about how I had cheated and killed the man who loved me. After the service, they only spoke to my parents and children as well as James' siblings. Not even my own father and children would speak with me. I thought to myself, I am alone. My family and friends have left me. No one cares that I miss him too. Don't they know I am hurting and grieving as well? God, what have I done? When it all was finished, they all wandered away in the safety of their groups and left me standing alone at the gravesite crying as I tried to understand why James would have killed himself. How could he have thought I would divorce and leave him? No one tried to console me. There was no one there with me. No one there for me. Even the priest looked pleased when he was waylaid and distracted, and found reason to talk with someone as he quietly slipped away so he didn't have to speak with me again. My mother had mumbled something about having to get the kids home. They weren't telling the whole truth as I knew they were holding a wake for James at their house. I'd overheard his two brothers talking as I stood by myself, crying. No one had told me about it and I wasn't invited. The sun was setting and I was still crying and sitting as close as I could to James's coffin when some staff came over to tell me it was closing time. They said I had to leave so they could lock up. They helped me to my feet and asked if anyone was with me as they looked around for someone to take care of me. I started to sob uncontrollably at that. Then one of the workers realized I was alone and escorted me to my car. As I slowly walked away, I saw their front-end loader pour dirt onto James's coffin to fill his grave. Every bucket full poured onto James seemed to push him further from me. I sat in my car watching the mound of earth above James until it was too dark to see, and then I sat just looking out into the darkness. My future without him. I woke next morning still sitting in my car in the car park at the cemetery. Obviously no one had missed me. Lonely days turned to lonelier weeks, so I decided to email Michael. We had not communicated since my birthday. I told him, James killed himself after he caught us cheating, and now I am by myself and very lonely. His answer shocked me when he said, "It was you who cheated, not me. As far as I am concerned, you were there with his permission, and he got his jollies knowing what I was doing to you. If you didn't have his permission, then it's you who destroyed your marriage and killed your husband. I've got an open marriage and my wife and I both play around a bit. I am not interested that James has killed himself or that you're by yourself and alone now. Really, we had nothing in common except the cruise and the sex, and to be honest, it wasn't even great sex. Anyway, I've got 3 children already, and I certainly don't want to be saddled with 4 more or you for that matter." I remembered he told me he loved me when we were walking arm in arm around the top deck in the moonlight, and now this. I now knew he had stolen my love that should have rightly been James on the cruise, and worse still on our wedding anniversary and my birthday as well. I'd been a complete and total fool as well. I cheated the man I loved, and who had loved me unconditionally for so long until he could take no more. Even in death he loved me. I'd realized my stupidity far too late. My life was destroyed and the man I loved was dead. Gone from my life, and I was so lonely without him. I was suddenly angry at James for not being there and protecting me. He should have stopped me. It was his fault. Although I spoke to my mother most days on the phone, it was over a month later before they brought my children around for a visit. Really to pick up some more of their clothes as the season changed. My father still refused to hold a conversation with me, and at best only tolerated my being in the same room with him. How could he treat me like that? I had let myself go and I hadn't done any housework since the funeral, and I found no reason to shower every day. Actually, not at all. None of our old friends called in to see me or even phoned. They had abandoned me after what I had done to the best husband a wife could ever have. Cooking wasn't really a problem as I was never hungry anymore, and I hardly slept in our bed, so I never bothered to change the sheets. When I did sleep there, I could smell James on his pillow. I cried every time. I really did try to clean up the house after my parents phoned to say they were on their way, but it ended up they all stayed overnight and cleaned up the house for me. My father visited the 24-hour supermarket to restock my pantry and freezer as there was no food in the house. Only some stale biscuits I had been eating when I felt like it. It was so nice to have my children around me again, but a few times I yelled at them for silly things they did. After that, they refused to talk with me again. The next day, while my father drove my children to school, my mother drove me to our family doctor. I'd lost some weight, but I knew there was nothing wrong with me. My mother insisted. We waited for a bit as we didn't have an appointment, but he saw us as soon as he could. We talked about James' death and about my marriage before the cruise and what I had done on the cruise and since. I was honest with him as my mother looked on in complete shock. She thought she knew it all already. She was wrong. I told him everything thinking I could convince him there was nothing wrong with me. I had no idea why my mother would think there was. He asked to see James' letter. I didn't bring it, and I certainly didn't know my mother had a copy. We discussed my loss of weight, and if I had been looking after myself. The doctor told me. I was really saddened to hear James took his life. He never exhibited any signs of suffering from depression. It all must have got on top of him, and it's so sad he felt the need to do what he did. He was such a wonderful man. I am sure he wasn't suffering from depression. What he was suffering from was the result of living long-term with someone who was and also untreated. There are always counselors and organizations in our communities who are willing to help if ever anyone reaches the stage where they consider taking their own life. I don't think it will matter now if I tell you. James came in to see me some months before your cruise to discuss your changed behavior and moods. I wish I'd had taken more time to help James wrestle with his problem instead of just discussing yours. I hadn't realized how badly your problem had affected him. We both had hoped the cruise would help you. He said you didn't know he was seriously allergic to seasickness medication. Amy, he knew he was going to feel unwell the whole time he was on the boat, but wanted to be with you because he loved you. He told us he believed I was suffering from depression, and it was the cause of our marriage problems long before our cruise, and why I didn't let James touch me for 6 years even though I knew I loved him so much. He went on to say he believed it was the cause of my behavior on the cruise and since. He wrote a prescription for some medication and found some bottles of samples for me and opened them and gave me 2 to take. He told me I would feel a bit sick for the first few days, then I would be like the old me from years ago. He was right. I did feel sick for the next few days as I started taking his tablets, but then I realized that I wasn't the one who was sick and stopped taking them. Then I thought, how could he even begin to think I had depression? It must have been James who was sick because he took his own life. It took months before I could convince my children to come home to live with me again. But there was no longer any fun or laughter in our house. God knows I tried to make it up to them, but my mood swung so quickly. I blamed them for anything and everything. I was sure the neighbors were sick of my screaming at my kids all the time. I had to work now for the first time since I married James to supplement my income, and the only work I could find was packing bagged chickens into boxes at the local chicken abattoir. It had been nearly 10 months, and our anniversary as well as my birthday was fast approaching. I was very lonely as I still missed James so much. I found James' 35mm SLR digital camera in his wardrobe and checked to see if any family photos were on it that I could download. There were some great photos of the kids, but then I saw photos of Michael and me taken on the cruise. But how? We were kissing and hugging and holding hands like we were newlyweds. There must have been hundreds of photos, but then I started seeing photos of us making love in all sorts of positions, and me doing things to Michael I had always refused to do for James. I was stunned and wondered how James had taken the photos. I thought he had been in bed all the time sick. It was easy to see he was really sick, but now it seemed he hadn't stayed in bed all the time. Why didn't he stop me if he knew what we were doing? I felt dirty and so ashamed. Even though I knew it off by heart, now I read his letter again he'd left for me and realized he hadn't stopped me as he was too afraid of losing me. But I'd lost him in the end. It wasn't fair. None of our friends even phoned, and I hadn't been invited to any party since James' death. I wondered if the wives were worried I would chase after their husbands now. Whenever I phoned them, the phone would ring out, or if they did pick up, they always told me they were on their way out and promised to phone me back. No one ever did. I even tried to organize a party, but no one showed up except my parents. Even my kids went over to the neighbors. Finally, I was desperate just for company and someone to talk to, someone to hold. So went on a singles website to look. I met John. He seemed nice, but he came on a bit strong. We dated a few times over the next fortnight, and then he became very possessive and would spend hours parked outside my house to convince himself I wasn't seeing other men. Initially, I thought, he must have heard why James killed himself. I didn't worry about him, but there was something wrong with the way he looked at Laura, who just turned 14 years. He had a different agenda to mine and wanted sex, but I couldn't bring myself to get that involved with another man yet. I only wanted to be close to someone. One day after much soul searching, I phoned him and told him it was off and I didn't want to see him again. I let my kids know I told John never to come back, and they seemed happier he was gone from our lives. It was a week later and I arrived home late from work after some badly needed overtime, hoping the girls had started cooking dinner for us. As soon as I entered the house, I heard Laura screaming out and calling to her father to help her. I raced to her room and found John on top of Laura, and he was about to assault her. She saw me and pleaded for my help as he hit her to stop her kicking and fighting back. I tried to push him off her, and when that failed, I punched his arm. He just laughed at me. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed James' favorite cast iron frying pan and went straight back to her room. John realized I had returned, and between breaths as he kept hitting Laura, "You're next. This is your doing because you refused me. Now I'll have both of you. This little teasing bitch is first. Then the both of you'll be mine." Then he focused back on Laura. I stepped beside him and couldn't help but see him so close to my daughter. He was so close to succeeding and wasn't about to stop. I lifted the heavy frying pan and swung it forcefully onto the back of his head. The hit jolted him and Laura screamed. His head rolled back and his eyes opened wide. I swung the pan again with all my might and hit him in the same place again. He fell forward this time and landed heavily on top of Laura. She was screaming as her face and body was covered in his blood from the gaping wound on his head. I pushed him off her and helped her up. There was blood running from her nose. Her face was badly beaten, and her own blood was mixing with his and running down her face and body. She was only a teenager. How could he do this to her? I ran to the kitchen and called the emergency number requesting the police and ambulance, and I told them my daughter had been attacked, and her assailant was still in the house and my other children were missing. Laura had followed me into the kitchen and was screaming at me, "It's all your fault. You're the 304 who killed my father, and then brought that scumsucker into our house. I hate you and wished it was you who was dead. You can rot in hell. You're not our mother anymore. You're just a 304 in her body." I could not believe my daughter hated me so much. After she finished screaming at me, I frantically searched the house and found the other 3 children bound and gagged in a built-in wardrobe in another bedroom. I was still releasing them when I heard sirens coming from every direction. The police rushed into the house with their guns drawn, and they untied the twins. My daughter didn't even try to hide her nakedness, as she led them to her would-be assaulter lying still in his own blood on her bed. In my panic, I had forgotten all about him. They checked for a pulse and told us he was dead. Now I'd killed 2 men. One deserved it, one didn't. I heard Laura berating me to the police as they tried to get her to put some clothes on. The ambulance was on still its way. She ended up half crying and half screaming at them. My mother caused all this to happen. She's a 304. She killed our father, then brought that man into our house, and he tried to assault me. He kept beating me. I hope she burns in hell for totally destroying our lives. I hate her so much and I wish she was dead. I'll never ever forgive her. Ever. The police organized for my neighbors to look after my other 3 children until my parents could get there to pick them up as we rushed Laura to hospital. Tests were made and samples were taken, as well as questions asked and statements taken. My brief affair was having ramifications I could never have dreamed of. When they were finished with us, they drove us to my parents' home as my house was still full of forensic police for a few more hours. Next morning, my mother said she would drive me home as my presence was upsetting my children and my father. I was distraught, realizing he still couldn't forgive me for cucking my husband and ultimately being responsible for his death. At least my mother was still taking to me, be it barely. My children, led by Laura, were very vocal in their total refusal to come home with me, and they demanded to stay with my parents forever. They all blamed me now for what had happened to their father as well as what happened to Laura, and refused to stay with me or even talk with me again. There was no love in their eyes for me now. No hugs and no kisses goodbye. There was nothing for me and I had no one. Even my parents and siblings disowned me. I was living a nightmare, a real living hell. Weeks went past and my children refused to live with me now, so I formalized my parents, fostering the 4 of them, and arranged for my family payments to be paid to them from now on. All of their toys and clothes had gradually been taken to my parents anyway. I could do little else as they all refused to accept me as their mother any longer. They wouldn't even acknowledge I was alive, and Laura's words telling me she wished I was dead kept ringing in my head. I had screwed up everyone's lives. I thought about my dream last night again. It was so real. It was the same every night lately. I had woken in a sweat each time, and yet I knew they had only been dreams. James had come into our room while I was asleep, and I woke with him like he used to. From experience, I knew what was coming as he moved higher and kissed me passionately. He loved me. I woke with a start thinking James had really made love to me, and the past 12 months had all been a nightmare. I turned to where he should have been lying, next to me, but he wasn't there. There was just an empty space beside me. I ran to the bathroom in case he was there. He wasn't. Then I raced through the house like a madman, calling his name as I searched every room for him. It all was coming back to me now. The man I had loved for such a long time was no longer with me. He was dead and I was the cause. Slowly I dragged myself back to my empty, lonely bed, and as I lay down I held his pillow to my face to smell his scent. I wanted to join him. I needed to be with him. Thinking about it, I couldn't believe I had been unfaithful to James. He was such a better lover when I let him. So passionate and so gentle and caring. Why had I refused him for so long? Why did I find excitement with another man and hurt James so much? I missed him so much and kept looking for him every time I entered any room in the house. I still cried every day for James, and I cried for my complete and total loneliness. My home was only an empty shell now. It was just a house. My parents told me I should sell it and get a small apartment, but it was my last link to James. I had memories of him in every room. I could still hear him calling the kids in from outside at meal times or celebrating in front of the television when his football team won. Frequently, I found myself talking to him or making 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. I was sure in my heart he answered sometimes. At times, I could even feel him near me, watching. Oh God, I missed him so much. Our anniversary was close as I completed my research on the internet. My parents were right and my house should be sold. I decided it was time to move on, so went to my lawyer to discuss selling the house when I was gone and gave them my power of attorney in case it was needed. While I was there, I updated my will. Then I visited James' grave like I did most days now and sat next to him and cried for hours telling him my plans and that I loved him so much. I pleaded for him to forgive me like I did every day. Before I left the graveyard, the sexton came down to see me to tell me they'd maintain the grave sites as I requested, as I wouldn't be able to do it any longer. I went home and wrote a letter to my parents thanking them for looking after my children and left details of my lawyer, who held the deed to the house and my will. Then I wrote each of my children a letter telling them how much I loved them and deeply regretted hurting everyone like I did. I would miss each of them so much, but I had to be elsewhere. My life was empty and there was no longer a future for me here. I then put the envelopes on the kitchen table where they'd be easily found. Each letter was labeled with their names and a photo of us as a complete family was attached to it. My eyes opened slowly. I was praying he was beside me. He wasn't. It was our anniversary. I got out of bed and searched the house just in case. Even the mantle clock had stopped ticking. I returned to my room and made the bed for the first time in months. Then I searched my aging wardrobe. I wanted to look my best, so chose 2 outfits James had loved and laid them both out on the bed. I remembered I had never worn them for him. One outfit was to wear now and the other was for later. I thought I'd look rather nice in it. After that, I went for a long shower. With the hot water streaming down onto my body, I closed my eyes and could feel James. Then I spoilt it by opening my eyes and he was gone again. I turned the shower off, dried myself, and then dressed in the outfit James liked best, then returned to the kitchen. A short open letter I wrote was left on the table explaining where I could be found in case they were looking for me, as I didn't want anyone to worry about me, and listing me as a missing person. That would be a waste of everyone's time. In any case, I was sure no one would wonder where I was for a week or more anyway. Not even my parents, and definitely not my children. In fact, no one worried about me anymore. No phone calls and no visits, not even from my neighbors or old friends. Tears filled my eyes as I tried phoning my children to hear their voices again before I left them. I was glad their phone was engaged, as hearing them might have made me change my mind. I walked through my house one last time, soaking in the memories that came flooding back to me. Each room was so special. I could hear all their laughter and remembered all the good times we'd had as a loving family during all those years. Then I collected what I needed and hopped into James' car that I'd kept parked in the garage since it was returned to me by the police, and I left for his favorite park one last time. I cried as I drove to the place I felt so familiar with now, after having visited it so many times in the past 12 months. I would come here every chance I could just to sit quietly with my treasured memories and cry. I knew where I had to park his car, just where he had. I'd practiced what I had to do. Our favorite CD was playing and I listened to the songs we loved the most and used to sing along with together a very long time ago when times were better for us. All the time I kept thinking of James and hoping he'd be waiting there for me so I could spend eternity with him. If he wasn't, it would be a long time in hell for me. If that was the price I'd have to pay for my infidelity and what I'd done to him, then so be it. As I drifted off to sleep to the vibration and gentle noise of the motor, I heard James start singing along with the song he loved the best that happened to be playing. I opened my eyes and looked across and saw him sitting next to me, looking and smiling at me as he sang his favorite love song. Our song. He reached out his hand to me, and I held out mine to him as I felt him for the first time in a year. I knew I wasn't dreaming this time. He moved closer to me, then he put his hand to my cheek like he used to. Then we hugged and kissed passionately for the first time in over 7 years. I whispered, "Happy anniversary, James. I love you and I've missed you so much." His face was touching mine as we both cried when we kissed. As I closed my eyes again, I could feel our combined tears rolling down my cheeks. My arms were holding him so tightly, and I knew I'd never let him go again. Next morning at breakfast, 4 children were bubbly, and the youngest 2 were so excited. Their grandparents listened to them all talking at once as they tried to understand what the kids were saying. It took a few minutes, then they finally understood as each child told the others how their mother and father had been to see them during the night. They all told the same story. Their parents were happy and holding hands. They had come to tell each of them they were together again like they were always meant to be. Their grandmother went white and reached for her husband to steady herself. He was struggling himself, and was trying to sit down before he collapsed. They hurried their grandchildren to get ready and dropped them at school early, then raced to their daughter's house. They let themselves in with the spare key they kept, then repeatedly called out to Amy until they saw the letters on the table. Praying silently in their hearts for their daughter, they sat at the table and picked up the open letter. The letter confirmed their greatest fears, and they knew where she was. They'd been there before as well. Both started crying uncontrollably as they moved together, holding each other tightly as they remembered how harshly they'd all treated her since James' death, particularly when they knew of her illness. They were finally crying for Amy. What made it so much worse for them was that their tears were too late for her now. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.